Hi, and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 1. I'm going to split this lecture into multiple parts. This is Part 1. The objectives of this first chapter are to introduce the core terms and ideas of morality, distinguish morality from other closely related areas, and then move toward a basic working definition of morality. Most students will have had a little bit of exposure to these concepts, but it's important that we use the definitions and terms as the authors of the textbook lay out. The first big question is, what is the relationship between philosophy and ethics? Philosophy, essentially, in the Greek, means lover of wisdom or friend of wisdom. And philosophers try to be a friend to wisdom by asking questions and studying why something is the case. Ethics seeks wisdom by asking about right and wrong, good and bad. Ethics and morality are terms that are typically interchangeable in ordinary language. For our purposes, though, they mean slightly different things. Ethics comes from the Greek ethos, meaning character, while morality derives from the Latin, meaning customs or manners. Commonly, we speak of people being ethical or moral to mean good or right, and unethical or immoral to mean wrong or bad. Philosophical ethics is the study of what makes something moral or ethical, good or right, and unethical or immoral, bad or wrong. Philosophers have considered what makes something morally good or bad, right or wrong, in relation to a range of characteristics. For example, does moral goodness involve some relation to happiness or pleasure? Does the good involve excellence of some sort, or harmony and creativity? Is it possible to be amoral, that is, indifferent to right and wrong? So we've talked about being moral or immoral, but what about this middle area or this gray zone? What about being amoral? And we can think of someone possibly incapable of recognizing the significance of right and wrong, and perhaps that person would be considered amoral. They're just indifferent to right and wrong. Then there's the issue of whether things can be non-moral. For example, the pen that I write with appears to be neither moral nor immoral itself. But if I use it as a weapon, then it enters the domain of morality, and it could be used for good, if I use it somehow to defend myself, or it could be used for bad, if I use it as a weapon against someone who's innocent. There are two different approaches to morality. The first that we're going to talk about is the scientific or descriptive approach. And this approach emphasizes the observation of human behavior and the positing of conclusions based on those observations. So an example is that psychologists have claimed that human beings are basically selfish. And they base these claims on observations of human conduct. The scientific or descriptive approach is descriptive in that it is value-free. It doesn't make any judgments as to the rightness or wrongness of the behavior. So psychologists, under the scientific approach to morality, will simply say human beings are selfish, but they make no comment about whether being selfish is morally right or morally wrong. The philosophical approach is composed of two different parts, normative or prescriptive, and meta-ethics or analytic ethics. So just to review, we have the scientific approach and then the philosophical approach. Under the philosophical approach, we have two branches, normative and meta-ethics. Taking first normative or prescriptive ethics. The first part of the philosophical approach deals with norms and prescriptions. This approach explores the question, how should we act? What should we do? Now, the psychologists from a moment ago study how human beings act. Philosophers go beyond that mere description and say, or ask, how should we behave? We know what the psychologists say, we're selfish, but should we be selfish? Now we're in the realm of philosophy. The second branch under the philosophical approach is called metaethics or analytic ethics. And a metaethicist is committed to the analysis of the language, concepts, reasons, and foundational structure of ethical systems. It has become increasingly difficult to create a system of ethics that is applicable to all human beings. So, metaethics has become the sole interest of many modern ethical philosophers. Can we synthesize these approaches? A major aim of this course is to present a reasonable synthesis of ethical views. And the authors of the textbook make that their goal throughout the textbook. So you'll see in later chapters, they kind of give us arguments for and against, and then a moderate position. And so here the authors are asking, can we synthesize these two different and divergent approaches? A comprehensive approach to the study of ethics requires the use of both descriptive and the normative and metaethical approaches. Moving on to the big question, what is morality? In order to further define morality, we need to say how it is similar to and different from other areas and non-moral uses of key terms. So, first we're going to start with distinguishing ethics and aesthetics. Ethics and aesthetics are two areas of study within philosophy that cover values and value judgment in human affairs. Ethics is the study of morality, meaning what is good, bad, right, or wrong in a moral sense. Aesthetics is the study of values in art or beauty, meaning what is good, bad, right, or wrong in art, and what qualifies as beautiful and non-beautiful in our lives. These two areas of study obviously can overlap, but they are distinct. An example is a Picasso painting. Aesthetically, the painting might be good simply because it was painted by Picasso. But perhaps artistically, it's good. Or perhaps technically it isn't very good because people's eyeballs are not where they usually are on their faces. But probably the painting by itself is not morally good or bad. It would probably fall into that non-moral category we talked about a moment ago. Now, the terms good, bad, right, and wrong can of course be used in a non-moral sense. So I could talk about a good meal or a bad tooth. These uses often refer to function, and we will learn in later chapters that Aristotle argued that morality is tied to the function of a thing. And so how well we're doing as human beings is tied to how well we are achieving our function. And this, of course, should not be confused with any idea that meals or teeth are directly linked to the ethical use of language or moral domain of human life. And so again, another example is perhaps if I tell you that my car is good, that my dog is good, but my car is running badly. I'm not saying that my dog is morally good. I'm saying he's good at being a dog. And I'm saying that my car, because it's running badly, is not very good at being a car. We also need to look at the connection and distinction between morals and manners or etiquette. Manners or etiquette are another area of human behavior closely tied to ethics and morals. However, it should be noted that manners are distinguishable from ethics and morals. For example, swearing or using foul language in most contexts is considered unacceptable. However, there is no necessary connection between this and immorality. Of course, manners and morals overlap, but care is required to distinguish them when there is no obvious connection. So if I invite you to my son's first birthday party and you swear or use a lot of foul language, I might think that you have poor manners or bad etiquette, but your use of foul language alone does not give me enough to then make a judgment about you morally. To whom and to what does morality apply? Morality may be applied to any one of 4 areas, including religious morality, morality in nature, individual morality, and social morality. Most moral systems involve all 4 of these areas, with one being the primary. So let's take a look at these now. Religious morality refers to the relationship between a human being and a supernatural being or beings. So an example could be the 10 Commandments. And the first 3 of the 10 Commandments explain a human's relationship to God. Violation of these commandments is considered immoral. Moving on to morality and nature. Here, this connection refers to the relationship between a human being and nature. Not too much else to explain there. Individual morality refers to the relationship that an individual has to him or herself. And social morality is determined by relationship between human beings and society at large. Now, another big question is, who is morally responsible? Should only human beings be held morally responsible? Would that make all other animals non-moral? So can my dog be morally responsible for something? Of course, he can be causally responsible for something. He can be causally responsible for the chocolate cake disappearing from the kitchen counter. But the fact that he ate the cake, is he morally responsible for that? And that'll depend on a number of things. How we value reason in non-human animals. But the evidence to date leads us to the conclusion that morality pertains to human beings and only to human beings. And evidence indicates that animals and plants should be classified as either non-moral or amoral because they have no moral sense. In France, in the 1500s, there's a case of some rats that ate a wheat crop or barley crop, I can't remember. And these rats were brought before a court. And the very first day, a lawyer showed up on behalf of the rats, or perhaps he was assigned to their case, and the rats failed to appear in court, and the judge was going to hold them in contempt, and the attorney argued that the rats were not properly noticed for the court hearing because rats do not travel in packs, and so it's unclear that all of the rats who were named in the complaint were noticed of the lawsuit. And so the judge continued the case for a day. The very next day, the attorney and the judge and all of the parties were there, but of course the rats failed to appear again. But this was a real legal case, and so in the 1500s, people were trying to hold animals morally responsible and legally responsible for their actions. Today, we don't see that. So if an animal does something, or if on a quiz you're asked if an animal doing something is moral, immoral, non-moral, or amoral, odds are it's going to be non-moral or amoral. Next big question, where does morality come from? Morality can be considered as having either a subjective or an objective origin. Values is totally objective. As objective, there are 3 possibilities for the origin of value. Values can be given objectively to us as human beings by supernatural beings. And in this case, the values, higher powers and humans, and therefore we should follow the teachings. We'll talk about criticisms in a moment. Secondly, we have values as being part of the fabric of nature. And in this case, morality is embodied in nature, and humans as creatures of nature should follow natural laws. Third, we have values as part of the furniture, if you will, of the world, independent of human beings. These possible explanations for the origin of value are expressed in the supernatural theory and the theory of natural law, and then the independent theory. Under the supernatural theory, the belief is that values come from a higher power. Under the natural law theory, nature is deemed to be a source of morality, and human beings must go along with that. Under the kind of independent or fabric of nature theory, under the independent or furniture of the world theory, values are out there, whether we exist or not. Now, those three were examples of values being totally objective. Now let's look at values being totally subjective. Some argue that morality only comes from within human beings, and that without human beings, there would be no value. So think of some act, some immoral act. That act ceases to be immoral if human beings cease to exist. There are criticisms of these various theories. Supernatural theories based on faith, and it's really difficult to prove that a supernatural being exists. And then we also face the problem of diversity of traditions. It makes it unclear kind of which supernatural being or which teaching or rule book we should be following of the supernatural beings available to us. And then we look at natural law theories. So-called laws of nature are descriptive. And one big question here is, are there natural moral laws kind of out there? And if so, how do we discover them? And how do we know that we've found the true laws of nature and that we haven't misinterpreted something? And then looking at the independent theory, can something have a value if there is no value to it? And then generally the subjectivism, are there values that are entirely subjective? And what would the world have for values without the presence of human beings? So the authors of this textbook, again, are moving along toward a synthesis model. And so here, we need to look at whether objective and subjective value systems can be synthesized. Some argue that values should be seen as both objective and subjective, and that a third variable of context should be added to the analysis. Under this approach, one would consider three things. First, the thing of value, or the thing kind of being valued. Second, the conscious being who is doing the valuing, or the valuer. And third, the context or situation in which the valuing takes place. So an example here is gold. And so gold may have a value in nature independently of us, and may have value to us, but only in certain circumstances. So for example, gold has little value to me if it's still buried in the ground and I have no means by which to dig it up. Even once I do dig it up, gold would still be in its raw form and not the kind of thing that I would wear as jewelry, or that I could sell to you to wear as jewelry. So the value of gold changes, and it changes based on what it is, if it's in its raw form or processed form, who's doing the valuing, and as the context changes. Values might be thought of as originating in a complex relation among these three variables, an interaction between the conscious being, the thing itself, and the specific context. So another example here is surviving successfully in a community. There are laws prohibiting killing, there's this moral prohibition against killing, and then we have a law against killing that's handed down by our government. And these laws are delivered to humans by other humans. So that's another area where kind of the law is going to change based on kind of what it is, what form it's in, who's doing the valuing, and a specific context. For example, killing may not be wrong if it's in a self-defense situation, but if that context changes, then the morality of the act may also change. All right, that's it for part 1 of this lecture. I will see you all in part 2.